In this video, we are going to see how we can install and set up Visual Studio Code on our system. So we are going to use Visual Studio Code as our IDE during this course. So the first step that you have to do is just go to your browser and you have to type Visual Studio Code. Now the very first link that appears on your search results, you have to click on that particular link. Okay, now you can see here that we have three different options for downloading. The first one is for Windows user, the second one is for Linux or Ubuntu users, and the third one is for Mac OS user. But since I am on Windows operating system, I will install this Windows version of Visual Studio Code. So you just have to click on this download button and your downloading will be start. So let's wait for some time. Okay, so you can see here that this Visual Studio Code is successfully downloaded and now I have to install it. So I have to click on this executable file. Okay, so you can see here that this setup window is now running and initially you have to accept the terms and conditions and then click on next. Okay, now here it is asking you to give a path where Visual Studio Code will be installed. So by default, it is taking or it is installing inside the C drive. So let's click on next. This is going to be the start menu folder. You just have to click next. And these are some extra options. So I want to create a separate desktop icon for Visual Studio Code. I also want to add these two options because they will be really helpful in future. Now let's click on next. And after this, we just have to click on install. So Visual Studio Code, it will take some time and the Visual Studio Code will be installed on your system. So after successfully installing Visual Studio Code and after clicking finish, you can see here that the Visual Studio Code is launched on my system. And this is how Visual Studio Code looks like. So on the left hand side, you can see here we got an option of open folder. So initially we need to select a folder where all our project files will be stored. You can also use an existing folder, but it is always recommended for a new project that you should use or you should create a new folder. So let's click on open folder and let's see whether we have some folder. No, we don't have. No problem, we can create a new one. So let's create a new folder and let's call it first project. Okay, now here we need to select this particular folder, so I will just select this folder. Great, so we have selected that folder and all our project files will be stored inside that particular folder. Now before we move on, I just want to take a moment and I want to explain why we are using this Visual Studio Code as our IDE. So earlier what we used to do is we used to install separate softwares or separate compilers for different languages. For example, if we want to write C or C++ code, then we need to install dev C++ or turbo C++, and on that particular software we can use or we can write C++ code only. But with the help of Visual Studio Code, we can write multiple languages code inside this editor. Okay, so if we want to write, we can write Python code, we can write C, C++ code, we can also write HTML, CSS, JavaScript code on this Visual Studio Code. So I hope you are convinced that this Visual Studio Code eliminates the need of installing different softwares on your machine. Okay, now after installing and after selecting the folder, now we need to create a project file. Okay, inside that project file, all our code will be stored. So in order to create a project file, you can see this option. So you have to click on this particular option. Now you have to give name to the file that you want to create. So I'm going to create a HTML file. So let's name it index. And then in order to tell it that this is a HTML file, so we need to write an extension that is .html. And then we have to hit enter. So you can see here that this index.html file is created and inside this particular file we can write our HTML code. Okay, so this is how we can create multiple files. We can just specify the extension. For example, if we want to create a CSS file, then we can provide an extension of .css and inside that file the code related to CSS will be stored. So this is how we can create multiple files and we can use it inside Visual Studio Code. Now, another reason of using Visual Studio Code is extensions. So with Visual Studio Code, we have many different types of extensions that we can use. So you have to click on this particular option, and then you can see that these are the extensions that are present inside Visual Studio Code. So for example, if I want to include a C++ extension, so I can just write C++, and you can see that these are the C++ extensions that are available. And extensions are some special functions that make the job of developer very, very easy. Okay, so you can install these extensions and it will be really, really helpful for a developer. So these are the reasons why we are using Visual Studio Code.